completely unhurried, the half-written letter in Oif's hands. The village of Clifton visible in the distance, its white-painted houses catching the last of the afternoon light above the bay. Oif stood in the cold for a long time. She did not go back inside. She had driven out to Connemara that morning as a solicitor, with a clipboard and a property inventory and a professional obligation to close an estate. She was standing in that field now as something she did not yet have a word for. Not a solicitor, not a stranger. Something that had been changed by what she had found inside that wall and could not be unchanged by anything that came after. Cormac turned his head and looked at her. She looked back at him. Neither of them spoke, which was appropriate, because the only thing left to say had already been said. It had been written in Declan Murtagh's hand 40 years before either of them were ready to hear it, sealed behind fieldstone and horsehair plaster, waiting with the patience of something that knew it would eventually be found. The turf smoke from the neighbour's chimney drifted across the lane. The Atlantic was loud today, invisible behind the ridge, but always present in Connemara. The sound of it threaded through everything like a low note held beneath music. Cormac blinked his one eye, settled more deeply into himself. He had been waiting for this. She understood that now. She had understood it for about 45 minutes, and it had reorganized everything she thought she knew about the last 6 months. Demathuturmo. 6 months earlier, Eowulf Brennan had not wanted to come to Connemara at all. She had wanted, with a directness she kept mostly to herself, to be in Dublin. To be in her flat on Clownbrassel Street, with its reliable coffee shop on the corner and its proximity to the legal district and its complete absence of turf smoke and elderly men who looked at you as though they were deciding something. She had wanted, specifically, to be anywhere except the small practice in Clifton that her uncle Seamus had built over 30 years and left to her in a will that was considerably more sentimental than legally binding, and that she had, in a moment of guilt and grief, and a certain kind of Irish family obligation that has no clean translation in any other language, agreed to honour. She had given herself 1 year. 1 year to get the practice stable, to find a proper buyer, and to leave with her conscience intact. That had been 14 months ago. Seamus's practice sat above the pharmacy on Market Street, in a building that smelled of damp plaster and old carpet and the particular musty sweetness of legal files that had not been moved in decades. The office held 2 desks, hers and the one where Seamus's longtime secretary, Brigid, had sat for 26 years and showed no signs of stopping, regardless of what Eowulf decided to do about the practice. Brigid was 61, decisive, and in possession of the filing system's organizational logic, which existed entirely in her memory and nowhere else. Eowulf had understood within the first week that Brigid was not an employee. She was the building's immune system. The clients Eowulf inherited from Seamus were mostly older, mostly cautious, mostly the kind of people who had used the same solicitor for 30 years and viewed any replacement with the suspended judgment of someone waiting to be disappointed. She had won some of them over. Others remained politely skeptical. A few had moved to a practice in Galway City, which she took without personal offence, because she was a practical woman and understood that loyalty to a place and a person is not always transferable. The one she had not won over and had not lost was Declan Murtagh. He had come to see her in March. She remembered the day precisely. A Tuesday, cold and clear, the kind of early spring day on the Connemara coast that performs a kind of emotional misdirection, all bright light and hard wind, the sea below the town looking like hammered silver. He had walked up the stairs with the careful pace of a man who was managing something, not fragile, not slow, simply deliberate, as though each step was being accounted for. He had removed his coat in the outer office, nodded to Brigid in the way of 2 people who had known each other for so long that greeting had become a kind of silence, and then come into Eowulf's office and sat down across from her and placed a sealed envelope on the desk. "My will," he said. She had expected this. She handled wills regularly. She reached for the envelope. He placed his hand on it before she could take it. "I want you to read it here," he said. "And then I want to ask you one question." She had agreed, which she would not have done with a client she did not know. But there was something in the way Declan Murtagh occupied a chair, a quality of stillness that was not passive, that seemed instead to be the result of a long and disciplined attention that made agreement feel like the natural response. She read the will. It took her 4 minutes to read it. It took her another 2 minutes to reread the relevant passage because she wanted to be certain she had understood it. She looked up. Declan was watching her with the patient expression of someone who has already had the reaction they are waiting for and is simply allowing it to run its course. "The estate," she said, carefully. "All of it?" "Yes, to a cat." "His name is Cormac," Declan said, with the tone of a man correcting a minor error. "He is 15 years old. He has one eye and some difficulty with stairs in wet weather. He is in excellent health otherwise." Awif set the will down. She was a solicitor. She had seen unusual wills. A will leaving an estate to a cat was not technically, legally straightforward. The mechanism required careful structuring, a human trustee designated to manage the assets in the animal's interests, a clear set of instructions for the animal's care. She was already moving through the procedural architecture of it in her mind, while simultaneously dealing with a second, less professional response, which was that this was the strangest document she had read in 14 months of practice, and possibly in her entire career. "The question," she said, setting the second response aside. "You said you had a question. Will you make sure he is cared for?" Declan asked. She had assumed he meant a relative, perhaps a niece or nephew, listed elsewhere in the document as a secondary beneficiary, someone peripheral to the estate who might need guidance navigating the process. She had not looked yet for the full list of named parties. "Of course," she said. "That's part of my obligation as—" "Not as my solicitor," Declan said, quietly. "As a person." She stopped. He was looking at her with the directness of someone who had spent a long time knowing the difference between the two things. "Cormac is old," he said. "He will need someone who checks, not who is legally required to. Someone who checks because they decided to." Besam Motai. She did not know what to say, which was not a state she found herself in often. She was 38 years old. She had a law degree and a professional manner and a reasonably complete set of defenses against the kind of request that bypassed the professional and addressed itself to the person underneath. And this man, this quiet retired schoolteacher from a stone cottage on the Clifton Road, had walked directly past every one of them on his first visit. "I'll check," she said. He nodded once. As if that settled it, he stood, retrieved his coat from the outer office without further conversation, and went back down the stairs. She heard his deliberate footsteps on each step. She sat at her desk for a moment, with the will in front of her. Then she got up and went to the filing cabinet and began the paperwork. She had not met Cormac that day. She met him 3 weeks later, when she drove out to Declan's cottage on a Tuesday afternoon to discuss the preliminary structuring of the trust and to assess the property for its inventory. The cottage sat back from the road at the end of a boreen lined with hawthorn, the kind of laneway that Connemara produced in abundance, narrow, improbably green, bordered by stone walls that had been built by people who are now several generations dead, and that showed no signs of stopping. The cottage itself was stone, low and long, with a slate roof and window frames painted a blue that had faded toward grey from too many Atlantic winters. A kitchen garden on the south side, overwintered and dormant, a turf stack against the gable end, a line of washing, 2 shirts, a pair of heavy trousers, moving steadily in the wind. Declan answered the door before she knocked. "I heard the car," he said simply. She followed him inside. The interior of the cottage was ordered in the way of someone who had lived alone for a very long time, not sterile, not spare, but organized according to a personal logic that would be difficult to interpret from outside. Books shelved by some system she could not immediately identify. A wooden table with 2 chairs that had not been arranged for company. The hearth going, turf glowing red at the center, the smell of it heavy and warm in the low-ceilinged room. A wireless on the shelf above the hearth, switched off. A single framed photograph above the mantel that she did not look at directly enough to make out, because it was not her place to look. Cormac was on the table. This was her first impression, a cat on the table. Not on a chair, not on the hearth, on the table, directly in the center of it, sitting with a composure that suggested he did not anticipate being moved. He was black, comprehensively, deeply black, in the way of certain black cats, where the light seems to be absorbed rather than reflected, so that the animal reads as a shape of darkness with edges. He was large, not fat, but substantial, the size of a cat who has spent many years being fed well and who has accepted this as his due. His left eye was amber, clear, and attentive. Where his right eye had been, there was a neat, healed closure, the fur smooth across it, so that that side of his face had a slightly flattened look, like a portrait with one dimension compressed. He looked at Oife. She had the distinct impression that he was performing an assessment that would be complete before she finished the thought. "Cormac," Declan said by way of introduction. Cormac did not acknowledge Declan. He continued looking at Oife. "He is very focused," Oife said. "He always is," Declan said. He moved to the hearth and stood with his back to it, which was the posture of a man comfortable in his own room, and watched her. "He'll decide what he thinks of you. And if he decides against—" "He hasn't yet," Declan said. "In 15 years." She was not sure whether this was reassuring. She set her briefcase on the one empty chair and opened it and began to go through the preliminary trust structure with Declan, who listened without interrupting and asked 2 precise questions that told her, in the way that precise questions always do, that he understood the document better than most people who sign them. She made the adjustments he indicated. She outlined the trustee obligations. She explained the mechanism for Cormac's care provisions. Throughout this, Cormac remained on the table. About 20 minutes into the meeting, without any signal she could identify, he stood up, walked the length of the table, stepped from the table to the arm of her chair, and settled onto her lap. She stopped mid-sentence. He arranged himself with the unhurried precision of a cat who has selected a location after careful deliberation and is now complete. His weight was considerable, his one eye half closed. Declan watched this. "He's decided," he said. There was something in his voice, a warmth held far back, like light behind glass, that she did not think he intended her to hear. She cleared her throat and continued with the trust structure. She did not, however, move Cormac. "Bausen Cupei, Esco." 3 months before the will was read, Cormac had begun his rounds. Oife did not know this at the time. She learned it later, piece by piece, from people who mentioned it in the tentative way of those who want to report something significant but are not certain they will be believed. Brigid told her about the butcher. The butcher, a large, quiet man named Thomas Fallon, who sold lamb and beef and excellent black pudding from a shop on the main street, mentioned it to the pharmacist. The pharmacist, whose name was Greiner, told the woman who ran the post office, whose name was Imelda, and Imelda, being the kind of woman who did not believe in keeping information to herself when it was clearly meant to circulate, had eventually told Brigid. What they reported was this: Cormac had been sitting outside each of their doors at dawn, not begging, not performing distress, simply sitting, facing the door, in the patient and deliberate manner of someone who intends to be noticed and is prepared to wait. Thomas had found him on a Wednesday. He had come down to open the shop at 6:30, and the cat was there on the step, black and composed in the grey early light, the one amber eye on the door. Thomas had looked at him. The cat had looked at Thomas. Thomas had said, "Go on then," in the way a man speaks to something he doesn't want to engage with, and the cat had not moved. Thomas had gone inside and opened the shop, and 20 minutes later had come back to the door with a piece of raw lamb kidney, which he had set on the step, and then had stood there while Cormac ate it with methodical precision, and then sat back and looked at Thomas again. It was the look, Thomas had said later, to anyone who asked. It wasn't asking for anything. It was like it was reminding me of something. Gren had found him on a Friday. She had not fed him. She had stood in the doorway of her pharmacy with her arms crossed and looked at the cat for a long time, and the cat had looked back, and eventually Gren had said something that Brigid reported to Alf as something quiet, not loud enough to hear clearly, and then had gone inside and opened the pharmacy without feeding him. When she came out an hour later for the morning delivery, he was gone. But she had called her sister that evening, her sister who lived in Roscommon, with whom Gren had not spoken properly in 6 years. Imelda had found Cormac on a Monday, which was the day the post office received its morning delivery, and she had taken it as a sign of something she did not specify, and had immediately brought him inside, put him behind the counter, and fed him leftover soda bread from her breakfast. He had eaten it without enthusiasm, but completely. He had then placed himself between the counter and the window and sat there facing the morning light for approximately 2 hours before leaving of his own accord through the gap at the bottom of the delivery door that Imelda had been meaning to weather strip for 3 winters. He came back twice more, Imelda told Bridget. Always the same morning time, always faced the same way. What Bridget had understood and had reported to Aoife with the careful precision of a woman who did not want to be accused of imagining things was this: Thomas Fallon, Greiner O Theater, and Imelda Keneally all had one thing in common. They had each, at different points in different decades, been connected to Declan Murtagh in ways the town had collectively, and without explicit agreement, decided not to discuss. The connection was not gossip. It was not scandal exactly. It was something older and quieter and more permanent than either of those things. Aoife had listened to all of this in her office on a grey afternoon in November, 3 weeks before Declan died, with Bridget sitting across from her and Cormac, who had taken to accompanying Declan on his visits to the office and then staying when Declan left, which Bridget had facilitated without comment by producing a folded blanket from the storeroom that now lived permanently under Aoife's radiator, stretched out beneath the heat like a long black silence. "What is the thing they all have in common?" Aoife had asked. Bridget had paused, not with uncertainty, with the pause of a woman deciding how much to give. "There was a child," Bridget had said finally, "years ago, before your time. Before most people's time who are still here." Aoife had waited. "It's not my story," Bridget had said. "It's his." She had nodded at Cormac. Cormac had not moved. He lay with his chin on the floor, his one amber eye open, the light from the radiator making a warm edge along the curve of his back. The pupil. Fionuala ni Briain had arrived in Clifton 8 weeks before Declan died from Cork, with a press card and a rental agreement for a flat above the newsagents and the particular forward momentum of a 26-year-old journalist who has just been given her first real posting and is determined not to waste it. She was small and quick and wrote with the focused velocity of someone racing a deadline that hasn't been issued yet. She covered council meetings and planning disputes and the occasional human interest piece that her editor in Cork asked for, with the optimistic assumption that rural Connemara was producing human interest at a reliable rate. It was not, mostly. Or it was, but the interest was distributed in the deep and private way of small places where things are known without being said, and this kind of knowing does not easily convert into column inches. Then she noticed Cormac. She had seen him first on a Tuesday evening, moving along the main street with the assured pace of a cat who has somewhere to be. She had not immediately thought anything of it. Cats in small towns have the run of the street as a matter of long-standing right, and a large black one-eyed cat was interesting, but not yet a story. But she saw him again on the Thursday. And on the Saturday, she watched him walk the full length of the main street, turn at the church, and proceed along the coast road in the direction of Declan Murtagh's cottage, with the directness of someone retracing a known route. She had asked about him, casually, at the coffee counter at the hotel. The woman behind the counter had said, "That's Cormac, Declan's cat. Does he often come into town on his own?" The woman had considered this. Not before now, he didn't. Fionuala had written this in her notebook and underlined it twice. She began following him. Not every day. She had council minutes to transcribe and a planning dispute about a wind farm near Roundstone that was generating genuine civic emotion and required careful management. But when she saw him, she tracked him. She mapped the doors he stopped at. She noted the times. She began asking gently about the people behind those doors and their relationship to Declan Murtagh, which was the question that produced the most consistent silence, not hostile silence, the specific Connemara silence of people who have agreed over time that some things are held rather than shared. She went to see Declan. She had expected resistance. He was, by all accounts, a private man, the term most used in the town, with the specific emphasis of a place that views privacy not as a flaw but as a form of character, and so private carried a certain respect. He received her on the doorstep of the cottage which was not an invitation inside, and looked at her with the attentive steadiness she was coming to associate with people who had spent their lives watching rather than performing. "You're writing about Cormac," he said. It was not a question. "I'm trying to understand what he's doing," she said. Declan had considered this. He looked down at Cormac, who had emerged from inside the cottage and was sitting beside Declan's boot with his one eye on Fionuala. "Come back in a month," Declan said. "Why a month?" "Because I'll be finished by then," he said. And he had gone back inside and closed the door quietly, with the finality of a man closing a chapter, not a conversation. She had not understood what he meant. Not until December, when Bridget called her and told her that Declan Murtagh had died in his sleep on a Sunday night and that his will was being read on the coming Thursday. And then she had understood, with the particular cold clarity of comprehension that comes too late to be useful, what "finished" had meant. The will reading had taken place in Oif's office at 10 in the morning on a Thursday in December, when the sky above Clifton was the colour of old pewter and the rain was coming in flat off the Atlantic in the way that Connemara rain arrived in winter, not falling so much as occupying the air, present in every direction at once. The parties present were Aoife in her professional capacity, Bridget, who had been listed in the will as the human trustee for Cormac's care provisions, a designation that had surprised Bridget not at all, in the calm and accepting way of someone who had long ago made peace with the practical demands of loyalty. Thomas Fallon, Grain O Flytheata, and Imelda Conneely, each of whom had received a letter from the estate directing their attendance. Fionuala, who had come because Bridget had called her and said, "You should be here," which was the most specific invitation the journalist had received for anything in Clifton and which she treated accordingly. And Cormac. Cormac had arrived in the office that morning in Bridget's arms, which was the only acceptable means of transport for an animal who had made it clear over 14 months of office visits that he would come and go as he chose. He had been placed on the floor. He had walked immediately to the centre of the room, turned once, and sat down, facing the desk where Aoife sat. He had not moved since. Aoife had read the will aloud. She had done this with the clean, careful delivery of someone who has trained herself to read legal documents without editorial commentary, because the document speaks for itself and it is not the solicitor's place to curate the audience's response. She had watched, over the edge of the pages, the faces in the room. Thomas Fallon's face had gone very still. Grain's hands had clasped in her lap. Imelda had pressed 2 fingers against her mouth and looked at the window. Fionuala had stopped writing mid-word and looked up. The will did not explain itself. Declan's wills never would. It stated the estate, including the cottage, the land, the savings account, and all personal property, was held in trust for the benefit of one Cormac Murtagh, a black cat, aged approximately 15 years. The human trustee responsible for Cormac's care and for the management of the estate assets was Bridget Ní Flytheata. Upon Cormac's natural death, the estate would pass to a specific charitable organisation, a children's welfare foundation with offices in Galway, unless the trustee identified other appropriate distribution. Aoife finished reading. The room was quiet for a moment, with the particular quality of a room in which something important has just been said in careful language. Then Thomas said, "Why?" He was not asking about the will. She knew that. They all knew that. He was asking the question that the will had been designed not to answer, and that Declan had arranged to be answered by other means. Aoife had looked at Cormac. Cormac looked back at her. He stood up. He walked directly to the office door, the interior door, not the outer door, and sat down in front of it. The door led to Seamus's old storeroom, which now served as Aoife's archive. She had not been in there in 2 months. There was nothing in there relevant to today's proceedings. She looked at Cormac. He did not move. She looked at Bridget. Bridget said, in the tone of a woman who has been watching things for a very long time, "He's done this before, when he wants a door opened." Aoife set the will down. She stood up. She walked to the door and opened it. Cormac went inside. She followed him. The storeroom smelled of old paper and the cedar lining of Seamus's filing boxes, which her uncle had used for 40 years with the conviction of a man who believed in wood. The boxes were stacked on metal shelving along 3 walls, labelled in Seamus's handwriting, small, precise, the letters of a man who did not trust anyone else's filing. She had gone through most of them in the first 3 months. Client files, court records, property documents, correspondence dating back to the early 80s. Cormac walked to the shelving on the far wall. He stopped in front of a box on the second shelf. It was labelled, in Seamus's hand, M. Personal. She had not opened it. Personal correspondence was outside her professional obligation, and she had set it aside with the intention of eventually going through it and returning whatever seemed relevant to its proper owner or disposition. Cormac looked at the box. He looked at Oife. He placed his front paw against the shelf, directly below the box, and held it there. She lifted the box down. She set it on the small table in the center of the room. She opened it. The box contained 3 bundles of letters tied with brown string, a birth certificate, 2 photographs, and a sealed envelope on top of everything else, addressed in handwriting she had not seen before, not Seamus's hand, but an older, more deliberate script, to no one. Simply sitting there, unsealed, the envelope flap tucked inside rather than sealed, as though whoever had placed it there had wanted it to be found easily when the time came. Oife picked up the envelope. Cormac sat down on the table beside the box and watched her. She unfolded the letter inside. It was 2 pages, written in the same deliberate hand, dated 18 months ago, which was approximately 6 months before Declan had come to her office with his will. She read it slowly, the way she read things that matter, and as she read it, the room became very quiet around her, the way rooms do when something that has been true for a long time is finally being said aloud. She read it twice. Then she carried it into the outer office, where Brigid and Thomas and Graine and Imelda and Fionuala were sitting in the various postures of people waiting for something they cannot name, and she stood in front of Seamus's old desk that was now her desk, and she said, "He left a letter, for all of you. I think it was meant to be read like this, together." Nobody spoke. She looked down at the pages, and she read, The letter was not long. Declan Murtagh had never been a man for length. He had been, for 34 years, a school teacher in this part of Connemara, and he had understood the value of precision, the right amount of words, used without waste. He wrote, 41 years ago, a child was left at this practice, not abandoned, left in trust, by a mother who had no choice and a solicitor, Seamus, who was already old enough to know that some things belonged to the future rather than the present, who understood what needed to be kept. He wrote, I was the school teacher. I was the one who found the note beside the child's coat on the doorstep of Seamus's office. I was the one who went with Seamus to the necessary people. I was the one who stayed through the months that followed while the arrangements were made. I had no authority. I had no legal standing. I had only the certainty that this particular child needed someone to pay attention, and I was there, and so I paid attention. He wrote, Thomas Fallon. Your mother was 19 years old. You were 8 months. She left for England that December and did not come back, which is not a story about cruelty. She wrote every year until I retired, and I kept every letter, and they are in Seamus's box, tied with string, and they are yours now. She was someone who was given an impossible choice and made it the only way she could. She loved you. She loved you specifically, not in the general way people say. She described your hands in her first letter, your hands at 8 months. I think about that. Thomas did not make a sound. He wrote, Graine o Flaithéarta. Your uncle came to me in the winter of 1987, when you were 11 years old, and your mother was very ill, and your father had been gone long enough that nobody expected him back. He asked me what I could do. I could not do much. What I did was find the money for the pharmacy course you took in Galway at 18 from a fund that Seamus and I put together from 3 sources that I will not name because they did not want to be named. They simply wanted you to have what you needed. You became what you became without knowing who helped you get there. This is not a debt. There is no debt. I am telling you because you always seem to carry some small, unspoken uncertainty about whether you belonged here, and I wanted you to know that people decided, quite deliberately, that you did. Graine had closed her eyes. He wrote, Imelda Keneally, your grandmother. 30 years ago, when the post office was failing and the Keneally family was going to lose it, it was Seamus who drew up the arrangement that kept it in your name. It was a different time. Women did not hold certain titles alone. The arrangement was legal but not advertised, because drawing attention to it would have required explaining what we were doing, and explaining it would have required fighting for it, and fighting takes time that your grandmother did not have. You have run that post office for 16 years. I want you to know it was always yours. It was made so deliberately by people who thought you deserved to keep what was yours. Imelda had removed her fingers from her mouth and set them flat on her knees and looked at the wall with the expression of someone recalibrating something very large, very quietly. He wrote, "I am telling you these things now because I am 84 years old and I have run out of reasons to keep them quiet. I kept them quiet for decades because the keeping was what was needed, because the knowledge would have complicated things before it could help them. Now it cannot complicate anything. Now it can only be what it is, an account of what happened and why and by whose hands." He wrote, "Seamus knew all of it. He kept it better than I did, because he was built for keeping. I was only a school teacher. I was not built for secrets. I was simply someone who was there when things happened and who understood that being there obligates you to something." He wrote, "The letter was meant to be found. I put it in Seamus's box because I knew Seamus's practice would eventually produce someone willing to open a box they were not required to open. I did not know who. I left Cormac to take care of the rest." He wrote at the very bottom of the second page, in slightly heavier hand, as though he had pressed more deliberately, "Cormac has been with me for 15 years. He has watched everything. He knows every door in this town that needs opening, and he has always known which order to open them in, and I trust him more than I have ever trusted a solicitor, no offence intended, however, to make sure the right things happen in the right order." He wrote, "Take care of him." Oy folded the letter. The room was very quiet. Outside, the Connemara rain moved against the windows in its flat, occupying way. The radiator clicked beneath the window. Cormac had come back out of the storeroom at some point during the reading, she was not certain when, and was now sitting in the centre of the room again, in the same spot he had occupied at the start of the meeting, his one amber eye moving with unhurried attention from face to face, the way it had been doing since the morning began. Tomas was looking at his hands, the large, quiet hands of a man who had spent 40 years not knowing whose hands they resembled. Grana was very still. The kind of still that comes after something shifts, after the weight you've been compensating for is suddenly redistributed and your body doesn't quite know how to stand yet. Imelda was nodding slowly, the small repeated nod of someone confirming something for themselves, a private conversation that had been going on for a long time and had just received a very significant answer. Fionuala had not written anything. Her notebook was open in her lap. The pen was in her hand. The page was blank. She would write later. She would write well, Oif thought, because she was the kind of journalist who understood that some stories require you to stop performing the act of collecting them and simply receive them first. Bridget was watching Oif. Oif met her gaze. "You knew," Oif said. Bridget considered this. "I knew the shape of it," she said. "Not the whole of it. Seamus kept it. That was his job." "And Cormac?" Bridget looked at the cat. "He knew who needed finding," she said simply. "He always has." The morning after the will reading, Awifa drove out to the cottage. She had not planned to. She had planned to return to the office, to begin the necessary correspondence with the Galway solicitors who would coordinate the charitable transfer arrangements, to draft the formal notice of trust establishment for Bridget's records, to do the dozen careful administrative things that an estate required in its first days. She had a full calendar. She had a system. But she had driven past the turn for Market Street and continued on the Clifton Road without quite deciding to, the way you continue reading a letter that has already said the most important thing. The boreen to the cottage was glazed with frost. The hawthorn on either side held the cold in its grey branches. The Atlantic was audible before visible, that constant low conversation of the Connemara coast, neither threatening nor welcoming, simply present. When she pulled up at the cottage gate, the morning was sharp and clear, and the sky over the bay was the pale, washed blue of winter light on water. She sat in the car for a moment. She was not certain what she had come to do. She was experienced enough to know that this was unusual. She was a woman who generally knew what she had come to do. She got out. The cottage was cold inside, in the way of stone buildings after a few days without a fire, not damp, not unpleasant, but holding the memory of warmth rather than the thing itself. She had a set of keys from the estate inventory. She let herself in and stood in the main room and looked at the ordered interior she had visited 3 times in 6 months, at the books on their shelved system, at the 2 chairs at the wooden table, at the wireless above the mantel, and the hearth that was grey and settled with old ash. Cormac was in the chair by the window. He had clearly been there all night. His large black form was fully settled into the cushion, in the way of a cat who has slept in a specific spot for so long that the cushion has shaped itself to him and not the other way around. He looked at her as she came in with the unsurprised equanimity of someone who knew she was coming. She sat down in the other chair. She had brought nothing with her. No clipboard. No file. She had not, she realized, brought her briefcase. She had driven out to a dead man's cottage at 8 in the morning with nothing but her car keys and the letter. She had been carrying the letter in her coat pocket since she folded it the previous day. She was aware of its presence against her ribs as she drove. She took it out and read it again. Not the whole thing, just the passage about herself. He had not written about her in the body of the letter, which was addressed to Tomas and Greiner and Imelda. She had not expected him to. She was not from here. She was not part of the 40 years of quiet history the letter addressed itself to. But on the back of the second page, in the same deliberate hand, there was a postscript. She had seen it when she unfolded the letter the first time and had not read it aloud. She had not read it at all in front of the others. It had felt private, not secret, but private, the way some things are addressed to you specifically, and you know immediately they were not meant to be shared. She read it now. He had written, "Our waif, you did not grow up here. You did not inherit this town's particular arrangement of loyalties and silences. This means you are the only person who can finish what I started, because you have no history to protect. The cottage will require care. Cormac will require more. What neither of them requires is a stranger who is kind, but absent. If you are still in Clifton when this is read, and I believe you will be because Seamus chose well, I am asking you to stay. Not forever. Long enough to understand what this place has been and what it could still become. That is a vague request, and I know it, and I apologize for it. I was always better at keeping secrets than at explaining them." She folded the letter along its existing creases. She sat with it in her lap. Outside the window, the frost on the boreen was beginning to release in the winter light. The stones of the garden wall showed dark and wet beneath it. The sea was still audible, constant, folding itself over and over in the distance. Cormac got down from his chair. He crossed the room, not to her, but to the hearth. He stood in front of it and looked at the cold ash. He looked at her. He looked at the hearth. She stood up. There was turf in the stack against the gable. She brought in enough for a fire, 3 sods, and some of the dry kindling in the box beside the hearth, and she built it the way her grandmother had showed her when she was 7 years old, in a house in Clare that smelled of the same things this house smelled of, though she had not thought of that house in years. The kindling caught on the second attempt. The turf began to glow at its edges with the slow, particular ignition of peat, deliberate, committed, not dramatic. Cormac sat down in front of the hearth and watched it. She sat back in the chair by the window. "All right," she said aloud. She was not addressing Cormac exactly, or she was, but she was also addressing the room, the letter, the particular weight of the morning. "All right." She took out her phone and called Bridget. "I'm at the cottage," she said when Bridget answered. A pause. "How is it?" "Very cold. I've started a fire." "Good," Bridget said, in the tone she used when something was exactly what she expected, and she did not intend to say so. Bridget, did you know about the postscript?" A longer pause. "I knew there would be one." "Did you know what it said?" "No," Bridget said, "but I knew it would be for you." Oif looked at Cormac. He had his back to her now, his attention on the fire. "He wants me to stay," she said. "I know," Bridget said. "In Clifton." "I know," Bridget said again, with the patience of someone who has understood the subtext of the conversation since before it began. "I have a life in Dublin." "You have a flat in Dublin," Bridget said. "That's a different thing." Oifa was quiet. The Christmas market is in 3 weeks, Bridget said, which seemed on the surface to be a non sequitur and was, our wife understood, nothing of the kind. It was Bridget's way of saying, there are things here worth staying for. It was Bridget's way of saying, I am one of them, and I will not say it plainly because that is not how either of us speak. I'll be there tomorrow, Oif said. Early. I'll have coffee made, Bridget said, and hung up. Fionuala came to the cottage 2 days later. She came on foot, having walked the 2 miles from town in a coat that was not quite warm enough for the Connemara coast in December, but that she wore with the commitment of someone who has decided the cold is not going to be the issue today. She had a notebook. She had a pen. She had the expression of a journalist who has been sitting with a story for 48 hours and has arrived at the place where she knows what it is. Our wife met her at the door. Cormac was behind her, which was the position he had occupied for the past 2 days with a consistency that suggested it was permanent. He comes when you open the door now, Fionuala observed. He does, Off said, as if he's checking who it is. Something like that. She let Fionuala in. They sat at the wooden table, the 2 chairs facing each other, the same arrangement the room had always offered, and Cormac jumped onto the table and sat between them, which Eoife had learned in 2 days to accept as his version of a meeting agenda. I want to write about it, Fionuala said. I assumed. Not as gossip, Fionuala said, with a directness Eoife respected. Not as a story about a man who left his money to a cat, which is the version that writes itself and which I am not going to write. As a story about what he did, what Seamus did, why they kept it and why it needed to come out now. Eoife was quiet for a moment. What Tomas and Grainer and Imelda think is their business, she said. The letter is their letter. I won't give you access to it. I'm not asking for the letter, Fionuala said. I have what I need. I've spoken to all 3 of them. Eoife looked at her. Already? Tomas yesterday afternoon, Grainer this morning. She paused. Imelda called me. Eoife almost smiled. Imelda calling the journalist was perhaps the most predictable thing she had heard in 2 days. She wants it told, Fionuala said. Not with triumph, with something quieter than that. She said, and I'm quoting directly, that the whole town has been carrying something it was never supposed to carry alone, and she is 81 years old and has no interest in dying with the weight still on. Cormac turned his head and looked at Fionuala. Fionuala looked back at him. He's evaluating me, she said. He does that, Oif said. Has he decided? Oif watched Cormac. He held Fionuala's gaze for a moment longer, with the patient attention of a cat who takes these things seriously. Then he looked away, toward the window, in the manner of someone who has concluded their assessment and is no longer required to participate. I think you passed, Eoife said. The article appeared in the Connaught Tribune on the Friday before Christmas, under Fionuala's byline. It was not long, it was precisely the length it needed to be. Fionuala had written it with the restraint of someone who understood that the story was not hers to embellish. Her job was to hold it up and let the light through it, not to rearrange its surfaces. She wrote about Declan Murtagh, the teacher, who had spent 34 years educating children in a county that the rest of Ireland sometimes forgot to look at. She wrote about Seamus Brennan, the solicitor, who had kept certain documents for 40 years in boxes that cedar-lined. She wrote about 3 people in a small town who had been the recipients of a kindness so old and so carefully maintained that they had not known they were receiving it. She wrote about a cat named Cormac, who had spent 15 years watching and who, in his final weeks with Declan, had walked through the village, doing the one thing Declan could no longer do himself. She did not write about Eoife. She had asked, and Eoife had declined, which Fionuala had accepted without argument because she was beginning to understand the local grammar of privacy and when to honour it. What she did write in the last paragraph was this: the will was read on a Thursday morning in December. Nobody in that room had known each other well enough before that morning to understand what they had in common. They understood it now. What a man leaves behind is not only what the document says. It is the fact of the document itself, the proof that someone, in a room somewhere, once turned their attention in your direction. That is not a small thing. In Clifton, at the start of winter, it turned out to be the largest thing of all. The article was read in the town. It was read carefully. in the way small places read accounts of themselves, with attention to what was included and equal attention to what was not, with the particular relief of people who find that the story they most feared being told has been told with care. Thomas Fallon was in his shop when his daughter called to tell him about the article. She had read it online before he had seen the paper copy. He was quiet for a long time on the phone. His daughter, who was 28 and had grown up in Clifton and knew her father's silences, waited. "It's right," he said eventually. "Are you all right, Dad?" He considered the question. "I think I am," he said. "I think I'm being all right, which is maybe different, but I'll take it." He hung up and finished wrapping a piece of lamb shoulder for the customer at the counter, who had the delicacy to say nothing and who had read the article herself at 6 in the morning with her tea and who had called her own estranged sister in Westport before coming out to shop. Mao. On the Saturday after the article, Awif went back to the cottage and built another fire and sat in the chair by the window with her laptop open and the Galway files on the screen and Cormac on her lap, and she worked through the afternoon until the light left the bay and the room was lit only by the screen and the fire's glow. She was still in Clifton. And it had been 3 days since she had thought about Dublin in any practical sense, which was something she noticed without yet knowing what to do with. Her phone rang at 4:30. It was a Dublin number she recognized, the practice where she had clerked after her degree, the firm she had always intended to return to. She looked at the number. She looked at the fire. She looked at Cormac, who had not opened his eye at the sound of the phone. She let it ring. This was not, she told herself, a decision. It was a deferral. There was a difference, but she noticed, as the call went to voicemail and the room was quiet again, that she did not feel the particular tightness she associated with missed opportunity. She felt, instead, something she had not felt reliably since arriving in Clifton 14 months ago, the sensation of being, simply, in the right room. Cormac adjusted his weight on her lap. She returned to the files. 3 days before Christmas, Bridget appeared at the cottage door with a casserole dish and a level of matter-of-factness about this that made it clear she had been planning it for some time. "You've been eating toast?" Bridget said. This was not a question. "I have eggs as well," Aoife said. Bridget came inside without further discussion and put the casserole dish on the stove and looked around the room with the assessing gaze of a woman who has been in and out of an office for 26 years and can read the state of a space in about 4 seconds. "You've been sleeping here," Bridget said. "Just 2 nights. The bed in the back?" "It's a good bed," Aoife said. "Cedar frame." He kept it very well. Bridget moved to the hearth and crouched down and examined the fire in the way of someone who grew up building them and has opinions. She adjusted a sod without being asked. The fire responded immediately with better draw. "Bridget," Aoife said, were you ever going to tell me about the letter in the box?" Bridget stood up slowly, with the considered movement of someone who takes their time about these things and is not embarrassed by it. "I knew the box was there," she said. "I didn't know the letter. Seamus kept the letter separate from whatever he told me. He kept certain things separate. But you knew something was in there." "I knew Seamus believed in being thorough," Bridget said. "And I knew that Declan believed in timing. He was the kind of man who understood that information has a season." She moved to the kitchen and began heating the casserole with the efficiency of someone who has made herself at home in other people's kitchens as a matter of practical necessity throughout her life. Cormac came in from the back room, where he had been conducting whatever private survey he conducted in the late afternoons, and went to the hearth and settled in front of Bridget's improvement. "He's been here since Thursday?" Bridget asked, nodding at the cat. "He was here before I arrived Thursday," Aoife said. "I think he's been here every night." "He did that with Declan," Bridget said. "Always on the hearth. Declan said Cormac believed that a fire needed watching." Aoife looked at him. He was thoroughly settled, his large black form curled into a compact warmth, his one eye half closed. "He was watching it already the morning I arrived," she said. "He stood in front of the cold hearth and looked at me until I built the fire." Bridget stirred the casserole. "He does the same thing with the outdoor tap in summer," she said. "Declan said he'd sit at the tap and stare at it if it needed fixing. He had a plumber out 3 times because the cat sat at the tap." Aoife almost laughed. It caught her a little off guard, the sound of it in the cottage, which had been a solemn place, a careful place, for 6 months. The laugh came out small and a little surprised, like something that had been waiting for the right moment. Bridget turned from the stove and looked at her with something that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. "It's good to hear that in here," Bridget said simply. The week between Christmas and the New Year was quiet in Clifton in the specific way of coastal winter places, the visitors gone, the short days giving what light they had briefly, and then withdrawing, the town settling back into itself. The main street showed its real proportions without the summer crowds. The pubs were warm in the evenings, with a different warmth than summer, more inhabited, more local. Arweef had moved her few things from the flat above the pharmacy. She had been renting it since her arrival, a practical arrangement that had never felt permanent, to the cottage. She had done this without ceremony over the course of 2 days, in the pragmatic way she made most decisions, identifying what was necessary, proceeding with it, reviewing later. She had called the Dublin number back. She had explained carefully and without drama that she was not returning to the firm. The person on the other end had been gracious, which helped, and had asked if she was well, which was the kind of question that people ask when they mean something larger, and she had said yes, which was accurate. She was well. She was unexpectedly well. The cottage had 6 rooms. She had spent 2 weeks in the main room and the kitchen and had begun to learn the other 4. The study at the back was where Declan had done his writing. She could tell from the chair at the desk worn in its particular way and from the stack of composition books on the shelf, which she had not opened yet because they were not hers to open yet. She had a sense, though, that they would be in time. The bedroom was simple and cool and looked out at the kitchen garden, which was dormant now and would need attention in spring. She had already looked up what had been planted along the south wall. She could identify lavender by its skeleton and had found a gardening notebook in the kitchen drawer, handwritten, with the years and the plantings noted in the same careful hand as everything else Declan Murtagh had ever written down. She was reading the gardening notebook on a Tuesday morning in the last week of December when Cormac, who had been sitting on the study windowsill, his second favourite location after the hearth, came into the kitchen and walked to the back door and sat down in front of it. She looked at him. He looked at the door. She opened it. The kitchen garden in December was bare and grey and laced with frost, the beds visible as low mounded shapes under the cold. Beyond the garden wall, the land ran toward the ridge in the uneven, boulder-strewn way of Connemara land, the stones showing through the thin skin of winter grass. Cormac walked out. He crossed the garden path to the south wall, where the lavender grew dormant and skeletal. He stopped there and sat down. She put on her coat and followed him. She stood at the south wall beside him in the cold morning, looking out over the ridge toward where the sea was, invisible but present, the sound of it carried on the wind. The Atlantic in winter was a different thing than the Atlantic in spring, more adamant, less interested in being seen, and more interested in being heard. Cormac did not look at the sea. He looked at the lavender. She looked at it too. She could see, even in the dormant state of things, that it had been well tended. The bushes were old enough that Declan had planted them with intention, not just impulse. They had spread along the wall in the way of lavender that has found its right place and decided to stay permanently. In spring, she thought, in June or July, they would be extraordinary. The bees would find them. The light on the bay would come through this south-facing gap in the wall, and the whole garden would smell of it. She put her hands in her pockets. "All right," she said, which was something she was apparently saying a great deal lately to a cat in the company of silence. "I see it." Cormac turned and walked back to the cottage. She stayed at the wall a moment longer, looking at the garden and the ridge and the winter sky above the bay, and then she went back inside. She made tea. She sat at the kitchen table with the gardening notebook open and read Declan's notes for the south bed from the past 3 years, learning the names of things she would need to plant in spring to continue what he had started, and Cormac settled on the table beside the notebook with the settled weight of something that has determined its place and is no longer uncertain about it. The wireless above the hearth played a station from Galway, low enough to be background. She turned a page in the notebook. In January, Tomas Fallon came to the cottage. He had called first, which was the courtesy of a man who understood that some visits need to be expected. He brought nothing, no food, no ostensible reason, just himself, in a coat and boots, and the large, quiet presence that she had observed across the table at the will reading. They sat at the wooden table with tea. Cormac came and assessed Tomas with the amber eye, then settled on the hearth, which Aoife had begun to understand as the equivalent of a formal endorsement. "I've been thinking," Tomas said, "about what he wrote." He did not use Declan's name. He didn't need to. "About my mother." Aoife waited. "I had a mother," he said. "I mean, I had the woman who raised me. Auntie Mare, though she was never really an aunt, just a woman who took me on because she was that kind of woman. She's been dead 15 years. But I had her and she was—" He stopped. He looked at his tea. "She was more than enough. She was more than enough." "Yes," Aoife said. He stopped again. He was not a man who spoke easily about the inside of things. This was visible and not a failing. It was simply the shape of who he was, the same way the cottage was stone and low-ceilinged. "I want to know what her letters said." "My mother's letters." He said, "They're in the box." "They are," Aoife said. "Bridget has the box. They're yours whenever you're ready." He nodded once, slow and complete, the nod of a man filing something in a place he can find it later. "And the thing he said," Tomas continued, "about how she described my hands, at 8 months. Sauning mei, Mount Saufes." He set his cup down. He looked at his hands on the table, large, practical, butcher's hands. "I keep thinking about that." Aoife said nothing. Sometimes the right response is the absence of one. Cormac moved from the hearth, crossed the room, and placed himself beside Tomas's chair. Not touching, just beside, in the specific proximity of something that has decided you should not be alone at this exact moment. Tomas looked down at him. "He left everything to the right one," he said. By February, the cottage had settled into a new rhythm. It was Aoife's rhythm now, which was a strange and occasionally vertiginous thing to acknowledge, that she was living inside another person's careful order and was learning it the way you learn a language, by speaking it imperfectly at first, and then, gradually, in the right register. She had opened the study and moved her files in. Her laptop sat on Declan's desk, which she had left in place because it was exactly the right height and faced the right direction toward the kitchen garden and the ridge. She had not opened the composition books on the shelf. She had moved them to the lower shelf, where she could see them, and she had decided that they would wait until she had been in the cottage long enough to be a fair reader of what was inside them. That might be spring. It might be longer. Cormac had a new habit. Each morning, he went to the front gate at roughly 7, regardless of weather. He sat on the stone gatepost in the manner of a cat who is expecting something and knows the approximate time. At 7:30 or 7:45, Fionuala's car would come down the Boreen. She had taken to stopping in the mornings on her way to town, just briefly, 5 minutes, sometimes 10, for coffee and whatever piece of news the village had produced overnight, which was her way of maintaining connection with the place she was still learning to inhabit. She and Cormac had developed an arrangement. He monitored the gate. She arrived with pastries from the bakery on Market Street. This was, Aoife thought, the most consistently Cormac had been predictable in all the months she had known him. He was not generally a predictable animal, but Fionuala made him a punctual one. It was on one of these mornings, a Tuesday in mid-February, with a cold, bright quality of light that Connemara produced sometimes in winter, cutting and clear as water, that Fionuala arrived with the pastries and sat at the table and said, without particular preamble, Graine called her sister. Aoife looked up from her files. "The one in Roscommon," Fionuala said. "They haven't spoken in 6 years. They spoke for 2 hours." Aoife set down her pen. "Graine came into the pharmacy this morning at 8, Fionuala continued, and she stood behind the counter, and she had a look on her face that I would describe as," she paused, searching, "like someone who has been holding their breath for 6 years and just breathed out." Aoife thought about Grain at the will reading, the clasped hands, the closed eyes. "And Imelda's nephew," Fionuala said, "the one in Galway, who she hadn't spoken to in 3 years over something about the post office lease. He came up last weekend. They spent 2 days going through the history of it." "How did it go?" "They shouted for about an hour on Saturday and then went to the pub and talked until closing time and then went to Mass together Sunday morning, which in Clifton counts as resolution." Cormac was between them on the table. He had been watching Fionnuala with the amber eye throughout this account, in the manner of someone listening to a report they had already filed internally. He knew, Oif said. Not a question. He went to their doors first, Fionnuala said. Before Tomas, before Grain, before the will. He was doing rounds for 2 months. I followed him. I mapped it. She had her notebook open. He didn't go to every house. He went to specific houses, always at dawn, always sat at the door and waited to be seen. And every house he went to was a house with something unfinished inside it. Oif looked at Cormac. He looked at her with the patient, uncomplicated steadiness of an animal who does not think it owes anyone an explanation. He's a cat, she said, not disbelieving, just reminding herself. He is a cat, Fionnuala agreed, who watched a very specific man for 15 years and learned every door in the village that mattered to that man. And when the man was dying, the cat went to the doors. She paused. That's not supernatural. That's dedication. Oif was quiet. Outside, the winter light was absolute and clear on the boreen. The hawthorn held its grey branches in it. Somewhere below the ridge, the sea continued its long, indifferent conversation. You're going to write about this part too, Oif said. Eventually, Fionnuala said. Not yet. Some things need to settle before they can be told. This was, Oif thought, the most Connacht thing Fionnuala had said in all the week she had been here. Something from Cork would not have known that particular patience. Something from Dublin certainly would not have. You're staying, Oif said. Fionnuala looked at her, a little surprised. In Clifton, Oif said. You're staying. Fionnuala looked at her notebook, then at Cormac, then out the window at the cold, bright lane. My contract is up in April, she said. That's not what I asked. A pause. Long enough to be its own answer. I think I might be, Fionnuala said quietly. Cormac turned from the window and looked at her for a moment. Then he turned back. His tail moved once, a slow arc, and settled. In March, the gardening notebook came off the kitchen shelf and onto the table, and Oif began. She was not a gardener. She had grown up in a third-floor flat in Dublin with a window box her mother had maintained with the determined optimism of a woman trying to bring the country into the city, and she had learned the basics, what needed water, what needed sun, what the difference was between something dormant and something dead. But she was not a gardener. She was, however, a woman who had spent 14 months learning the practice of another person and had discovered along the way a respect for it that was something like devotion. She followed the notebook. The south bed first. The lavender was already beginning, barely, just the faintest grey-green suggestion at the tips of the skeletal branches, the first sign that winter was releasing its hold. She cleared the bed of the accumulated debris of autumn and winter, the leaf fragments, the one small branch that had come down in the January storms, and worked the soil along the wall edge the way the notebook instructed. Declan had preferred not to amend the soil heavily. He wrote, "The land here is what it is, and things that grow in it grow because they belong in it." She read this twice. Cormac sat on the garden wall and watched. He had an opinion about the gardening, which he expressed by moving along the wall in the direction she should work next and sitting down pointedly. She had learned not to question this. It was cold in March. The wind off the Atlantic was still insistent. She wore her heaviest coat and her Uncle Seamus's old gardening gloves, which she had found in the shed, too large for her hands, but solid, and she worked through the morning in the cold garden while the sea was loud below the ridge and the sky moved fast overhead, with the high, quick clouds of a Connemara spring trying to establish itself against the winter's objections. By midday, the south bed was clear. She stood back and looked at it, the lavender at the wall, the cleared earth waiting for the seed packets she had ordered from the list in the notebook, the stone wall behind it, holding the south light. It was going to be something. In June or July, when the lavender came in full and the new planting took hold, this garden was going to be something that a person standing at the kitchen window would want to look at. She stood in the cold with the two large gloves and looked at it and let that particular quiet satisfaction move through her, the satisfaction of having cleared a path for something that doesn't yet exist and can see it coming anyway. Cormac jumped down from the wall. He crossed the path, placed himself beside her, and looked at the bed. He looked at her. She looked back at him. "I know," she said. "Spring." The last thing Declan Murtagh had left in the cottage that she had not yet addressed was the wireless above the hearth. It had been switched off when she first came to the cottage. It had been off on every subsequent visit. She had not turned it on in the weeks she had been living here, had been aware of it, this dark, unlit face above the mantel, but had not reached for it, the way you give certain things time before you open them. One evening in late March, Cormac walked to the hearth, looked up at the wireless, and looked at her. She crossed the room and turned it on. It took a moment to find its signal, a tube of static, then a resolution, a station from Galway carrying a program of traditional music, a fiddle and a bodhran in a recording that had the warm, slightly imperfect quality of a live session rather than a studio. The sound filled the cottage in the way that music fills stone rooms, fully, generously, with a warmth that takes the edges off the cold. She stood at the hearth and listened. Cormac sat down in front of the fire. His one amber eye reflected the firelight. She pulled the chair closer to the hearth and sat, and she listened to the music, and the fire gave its warmth, and outside the cottage the March evening on the Connemara coast was doing what it did, the sea loud and close, the first light still in the sky at 7:30, the absolute promise of spring carried in the air even beneath the cold. She had not come to Clifton meaning to stay. She was still here. The wireless played. Cormac settled his chin on his front paws, his tail wrapped around him, neat and complete. The fire moved in the hearth, and the music moved in the room, and outside, the long Connemara light was finally beginning to hold past the end of the day. He closed his eye.